So I've worked at the BFI for 20 years now, and I have to say that more than any other filmmaker, I've developed a very deep and personal connection to Kubrick. I never met him. Some of our panelists met him. Some are related to him. But I have to say that, unlike any other filmmaker, over time, the more I revisit his films, the more they mean to me, the more they change, the more I appreciate them in different ways. And what we're going to do tonight is to try and get under the skin of the kind of DNA of Kubrick's filmmaking, and perhaps ask a few questions, pull out a few of his themes, which are recurring throughout his career. And the thing I'm really interested in is how is it that Kubrick managed to make such an indelible and enduring mark on popular culture, on our shared popular culture. I mean, he really is celebrated, and he really managed to get under the kind of collective consciousness that we have. But he did it with films that were extremely challenging and provocative, and that to me is extremely interesting. So we're going to start in the early days, before he was a filmmaker. I've got this quote on the screen, which is Stanley talking about playing chess. And as a young man growing up in New York, he was quite an accomplished chess player, and this is famously quite important to his filmmaking style. Alan, do you want to say a few words about the significance of chess to Stanley?
I think, Katharina, you should say something about chess and Stanley.
Yeah, he was famously a chess player. He started from a very young age, and he would also take on sort of all-comers in, I think, Gramercy Park in New York. And he wasn't a chess hustler. He just liked playing, and I think it informed his thinking and his processes. He did try to teach me, and I was a dismal failure. But that was too sad. But it was something that he played throughout his life with cast and crew, and there was always a chessboard set up on set somewhere if he could find somebody to play with. So it was a lifelong passion of his.
I stuck to ping pong.
I did offer once to play backgammon with Stanley, but he refused to do so. But I think Stanley's early life is incredible, actually, really. And when you think of this young boy who was given a camera when he was 13 years old, and from then on, he sort of pursued his ambition, and his curiosity drove him. And I noticed at some point when Stanley, very early on in his career, said, "What do you need to be a filmmaker?" He said, "You need a camera and a tape recorder and imagination." And he certainly had that. But imagination doesn't come easily. It's something you pursue, and we were just talking about this, his ability to sort of immerse himself and you in these projects. When you look at those clips, every film, as Stephen said earlier, every film was different for Stanley. He explored, he was an explorer of the world. And then he had this incredible combination of both being able to immerse himself in something so he could immerse you into it, but the journey was an incredible journey. When we think that Napoleon, a film that we have never seen, but one day we'll talk to Jan about it later, maybe we all will see the delivery of something about Stanley's ambition for Napoleon. Here he was. He needed to know everything about him. He would ask questions, endless questions, and he'd have many of the answers. What did Napoleon like for breakfast? What did he wear? What was he like? And the question about character and design and all these things, these aren't just words. He felt, and you can see it in his early photographs, how were people positioning themselves? How were they gestured? Where were they in the room? And then the sense of drama that emerged out of it. His early work, that the death of Roosevelt, when he photographed the news vendor, and that was a picture he sent to Look magazine. I think when he was at the age of
17, was it?
16 or 17. And then, if you look at all the other pictures, you can see how his ability to see not just but pictures in sequence.
We have some pictures. Can we put the pictures on the screen?
I don't know if you've got the dentist waiting room.
I've made a selection that will just rotate as we speak. So he moved from playing chess. One of the things about chess, you could see in the quote that it taught him to think, and it taught him to consider very carefully what he was doing. But the other thing was, I think he did play for money, and I think he learned to hustle. I think he learned a little bit of good old-fashioned hustling in the chess match.
Well, that is the thing about Stanley, is that, I mean, no filmmaker has got away with what he's got away with. I mean, Stanley would begin a film and he would end it when he felt the moment had come, even if, as Jan will tell you, his prediction of how long it would take often was rather less than it did take. But his first film that he made, his short film, was originally those shorts, and I think then he was the age of 18 or something like that. Those short films would cost about $40,000, which at the time was a big budget, and he was determined he could make it for less, and so he did. He made it for a tenth of that price. And then you see these sequences. As you look at these pictures, you can see he isn't just taking a picture and observing what's happening. He's also, there's calculation in what he does. He's telling stories. He's always looking for a story. So the dentist's waiting room is a sequence of several pictures in which there is a narrative and a story. And he's fascinated by documentary. Of course, he made his own documentary early on, and one of the ways that I first met Stanley was because I produced a show called Arena before many of you were born, I imagine, but some of you may know about it. It's still going. And Stanley was really interested because it had such a range of topics.
So he's in New York. He's 17. He's working as a professional photographer. Then he makes his first film. He sold that film for $4,000 to RKO, which is the most they'd ever paid for a short film. And at this point, he's surrounded by modernism. Post-war New York was one of the key sites of modernism. I think that's important. And Kubrick was visiting the art house cinemas of New York and lapping up the films of the Italian neo-realists and John Vigo and Carl Dreyer.
Max Ophuls he loved.
Absolutely, Max
Fellini
Ophuls.
He liked. And he read a lot as well, didn't he? He was a sort of reader as well.
So we go from the short. He made a couple more shorts, which you can see we're presenting here in the cinema on the season. Then he made his first film, which is called Fear and Desire. He went later in his career, he disowned the film, and he actually went to lengths for people to not see it. So we won't spend any great deal of time here discussing it, but it is very interesting because fear and desire literally are two of the things which sort of drove Stanley creatively, and you can see it in the early film. Following that, he made a film called Killer's Kiss, which is kind of a muscular kind of thriller. Again, he goes back to boxing. It's about a boxer who falls in love with his neighbour, and she's being kind of slightly abused by her boss, who's a bit of a gangster and a dance hall runner. And this film didn't really put him on the map, but people took notice of it. And actually, still today, people like Scorsese cite it as a reference. I do encourage you to come and see it here on a big screen because it's a great experience. It's got a real kind of verite feel about it. It has a great energy. So the other thing about Killer's Kiss, which I think is interesting, is that Kubrick had $100,000 from United Artists to make the film, but they demanded that he recut the film to have a happy ending, which he wasn't happy with, but he did it in order to get funding for his next project. But it was the first kind of run-in that he had where he was kind of coming up against a kind of form of censorship, if you like. So following Killer's Kiss, Kubrick went on to make The Killing, which is now widely regarded as a kind of superior noir about a racetrack heist. Again, it's a fantastic film. We don't have time to run through every single movie because we'd be here all night, but The Killing is Quentin Tarantino's talked about it as an influence. It's kind of an amazing example of storytelling in the way that it's fast-paced and the timing in it. And then from there, what we see is Kubrick really taking a step up in the film industry and kind of becoming part of Hollywood. So yeah, and we saw some stills from Paths of Glory there. Could you say a thing or two about Paths of Glory and how significant that was to Stanley's career?
Yeah, it was a film that really put him on the map in many ways, also for critics. Of course, it split the audience, it split the critics. The film was forbidden in some countries. And
France especially.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was, I think, a really genuine anti-war film. And what I find very, very impressive is how the film develops, and it ends up is the only woman in the film. And we see all these soldiers, these macho guys who have gone through hell in many ways, almost falling apart, looking at this girl. And that's the end of the film.
And it was he worked with Kirk Douglas, who then made a point of asking Universal, I think
That's
it was,
right.
to hire Stanley.
Kirk Douglas was so impressed by Kubrick that he then, who was in charge of Spartacus really, asked Kubrick to take over and direct Spartacus, and many things in Spartacus are absolutely fabulous. It's brilliant. It isn't really a genuine Kubrick film, but it's okay. I mean, it's a wonderful film.
It was quite tough, wasn't it? Quite tough for Stanley, that film, because he had to follow a script that was there.
He had to follow other. He was not really in charge.
Anthony Mann was taken off the film in the first place, and he's not used to that and never had to suffer that one again, did he?
No, and but it served him well, and then he was finally free to do what he really wanted to do.
So he kind of had the experience of being a kind of a gun for hire in the old studio sense. He was hired on as a director, but it must have been a fantastic experience to be on a film of that scale with that kind of budget and the
$12 million budget, which at the time
in those days was huge.
Huge.
And saw best titles too.
Yes,
absolutely. So, as you say, that really did put him on the map, Spartacus, and then he made his first, what I would say, the true Kubrick film, which was Lolita. And we might think that was kind of a bold decision, because it's a very controversial novel by Vladimir Nabokov, and he asked Nabokov himself to write the screenplay.
Yeah.
And I watched it again the other night. It's quite a bold film. It's quite crazy.
Yeah, well, it's a film about a very sophisticated middle-aged man who was unlucky enough to fall in love with a young girl, much too young a girl. I mean, yeah, it must be terrible, but that's what it is about, and clearly it happens.
So he completely loses himself. This is Dr. Humbert, who's played by James Mason. Just completely loses himself with in the face of sexual desire. But he also, and this again is a theme that Kubrick comes back to, he loses himself incrementally through the film, but he also makes meticulous plans. Like he somehow arranges the world around him to achieve his goal.
But there is also an element of redemption as well in Humbert at the end of the film, isn't there? So first of all, the boldness of the opening sequence of that film, which is incredible, with Quilty played by Peter Sellers, from whom he got, as you know, amazing performances. But in all these films, somehow or other, the complexity of these characters at the heart of them, you can't predict what's going to happen. You can, at some point, be shocked by what they do, but then you can begin to understand, if not sort of somehow accept that the way they behave. And the way he can bring humour into this very dark situation is incredible too.
Well, that's something that does come up a lot in Kubrick's work,
Yeah.
the kind of the black humour, but it is humour after. I find myself laughing at the films quite often, sometimes when I feel like I shouldn't. And obviously this also, so again, this introduces a sense of controversy. Like Kubrick was very willing, in fact, willful about controversy, making something that was provocative. But also performances, extracting these performances from actors, because Peter Sellers is quite extraordinary in this film, and so is James Mason, actually. Both performances are extremely interesting. So from there, he goes on to... So I asked all the panellists to choose an extract of their own that they could speak to, and Jan chose an extract from Dr. Strangelove, and the link is obviously from Lolita to Strangelove, Peter Sellers...
Yes, I love that film. It's a film I didn't work on. I joined Kubrick later for Napoleon in 1969, a film that didn't happen. But I always admired Dr. Strangelove. And I remember we had lunch at the beginning of the first Iraq War. And Kubrick, we were all, of course, totally riveted to TV, what's going to happen. And Kubrick said, well, I sure hope I haven't made a documentary. Well, I think this is really a milestone in making films. And what's so interesting is that Stanley originally wanted to make this film straight, based on a book called Red Alert, a serious film. There was certainly no joking about it at all. And he realized while he prepared it that this arms race was so grotesque that you couldn't talk about it straight because it is just too silly. And then he had the idea of using humor as a further pillar to underline the seriousness of the film. And I think he succeeded, because while we may be laughing, we also know, well, this is rather close to the truth. And it hasn't stopped. The film is absolutely modern. And we can only hope that the prophecy of that film never comes true.
It chillingly opens with a health disclaimer from the American Defense Department saying this film could not possibly happen. And even more dauntingly, of course, Oliver Stone's series on Putin does involve a scene where they sit together watching the war room. It's,
So here we have production design really coming, and just that the War Room is such an iconic piece of production design, and I think it was Ken Adams' first film with.
It was Ken's first film with for Stanley, and Stanley had seen Ken's work on the Bond movie and was very impressed, and they had a very good working relationship. And then Ken Adam went on to work as a production designer on Barry Lyndon. But they were very close, and they were very similar, and they were very precise in their respective art forms. And they actually had a very good collaboration. But it was a great set. And if you come to the Design Museum exhibition, Stanley Kubrick exhibition, there are great models of the Ken Adam sets, and there's a huge installation just dealing with Dr. Strangelove, and there's a cool model of the War Room, which actually Ronald Reagan thought actually existed. he asked when he was after his inauguration, where's the War Room, which is kind of cool.
So again, but also again, as well as production design, there at the time that Kubrick made that super controversial political statement.
it was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Same.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it now feels very timely because we now have a madman in the White House. So it's,
Yeah, you think?
Yeah, when President Trump, the President of the United States, was on social media, on Twitter, saying things about his nuclear weapon is bigger than Kim Jong, I couldn't help but think of. I really did. I looked at it on Twitter and I was like, oh my God.
We'd certainly vote for Peter Sellers any day.
And actually, just on that it's really a film about communication all the way through it. There's a whole thing about no radios, and then there's a lot of it is on telephones. It's very interesting how communication is.
And how no system works. Nothing is foolproof.
The Coke machine, yeah.
And you've always got all these characters, the characters in Strangelove. We're talking there about those. They're all at odds with each other. They're all in their own worlds. They're all saying one thing, the other is saying another thing. It's incredible the dysfunction that's going on, and yet these are the people who rule the world. I mean, it's just.
I think the other thing about the film, in terms of the kind of DNA of Kubrick's filmmaking, is it's really the film where you see this amazing attention to detail, and there's scenes from within the bomber plane where they're reading out the different codes that come, and you see the different equipment. There was this kind of, for me, that's the first time you really see that kind of really precise attention to detail, which then becomes a real kind of tenet of his style.
Ken Adam actually had been a pilot in the Second World War, and he was a German fighter pilot, but for the British, and so he knew about his planes. And the research that they had done was so accurate that actually he said, we better do this research really, really properly to make sure that we get it right. And it was so accurate that people thought that he had, spies in the military, and a lot of people didn't like Dr. Strangelove, and Stanley was accused of treason.
Really?
Oh yeah, yeah. People thought he should go to jail.
So that part of the event was quite chronological. I thought it was quite important to give us all a kind of quite a good bedrock of the story of Stanley's early career. We're now going to kind of do away with chronology and going to skip around a little bit. And Jan and I, when we were talking about this event, we decided that if we really wanted to talk about the anatomy of Kubrick, something that's very, very important is kind of technical innovation. And Jan has a presentation which touches on a lot of Kubrick's technical innovations and also music as well. So Jan, do you want to?
Yeah, well, right. I start with a sentence by Jean Cocteau. It's a sentence that Stanley very, very much identified with. I didn't know that it was impossible to do. That's why I did it. And I have experienced that again and again and again, this stubbornness in pursuing an aim. I want to start with one thing, Kubrick's innovations. The technique of front projection has never been done. The idea was to use material that we all are familiar with because it's in traffic science. And when you drive at night and you have a high beam, the traffic sign is much, much brighter than anything around it. How come? Because the material has millions of little or thousands of little mirrors that reflect it, but only if you are in the same line, your eye is in the same line as your high beam, which is the case if you drive a car and you bring up the light. So now, therefore, he developed this system that allows to project a huge plate on such a screen, but what you put in front of it doesn't get the reflection because the people or the set pieces obviously are not made out of that material. And that was the key part for the opening 20 minutes of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the background are 8 by 10 plates which were shot in Africa, and the rest was in warm wood. Yes.
Incredible opening to a film with 9 minutes of no
dialogue.
No dialogue, nothing.
it's great.
No music for 9 minutes, and another 10 minutes of music and still no dialogue until 21 minutes in.
And Stanley had prepared narration over it to explain it. It was written, it was recorded. He had consulted lots of scientists and clerics and what have you, philosophers, about humanity over the development of the last one, and he kicked it all out. He all was doing, he said, forget it, trust the audience. Trust the audience. And you take a risk by trusting the audience, but hey, that's down to him. So here, split scan technique, again, something totally new, invented by Doug Trumbull to show how this is done. It's a very narrow slit where you film something and you duplicate it a little bit like a sort of a Rorschach test. And that's the result. Now, here's another thing, mixing.
Before we move on, Jan, so that was developed by Douglas Trumbull, and he went on to do the special effects on Blade Runner, I believe, and he also directed a film called Silent Running, which is another classic sci-fi thing. And there's something interesting here. We spoke about Ken Adam in Strange Love and Douglas Trumbull here. And even though Kubrick was a very singular kind of film artist who managed to gain an incredible level of control over the filmmaking process, top to bottom, which is very, very rare. He was also an arch collaborator, I think, and he also got the very best out of the people that he was working with. And obviously filmmaking is, by definition, a collaborative, creative process. So that, again, these are all the ingredients that are coming into his thing. But I think on 2001 especially, you really see him collaborating to amazing effect. So there's an interesting. The film came out in '68, I think, just before the first man on the moon, and it was
Year before.
the backdrop was the kind of
67, was it? Yeah.
Well, it came out 68,
67.
and moon landing was 69.
69, yeah. And so it's against the backdrop of the space race and all of that, and it really was a different kind of cinema that Stanley Kubrick was proposing here. Obviously, there's lots of avant-garde filmmaking, which is abstract, but avant-garde filmmakers weren't reaching the millions of audiences that Stanley Kubrick was. Maybe it's worth just talking a little bit about what happened when the film was released, because it's quite an interesting story. It's critics and all kinds of commenters really didn't understand it and really didn't like it.
Well, the film was really rescued by teenagers. That's what Stanley told me. That's his quote. That my film was rescued by teenagers.
You mean in a commercial sense?
In a commercial sense, yes. I mean, many critics thought the film was terribly boring, didn't understand it, couldn't make any heads or tails what this is Black Monolith and the ending, and I mean, so. But very young people didn't have a problem with it. They just took it as what it was.
And it was fantastically successful commercially.
Oh, hugely successful, but it was really made by young people, and mainly boys between, I would say, 13 and 30. And he got stacks of almost love letters from that group around the globe. I mean, and that is quite astonishing. Today it's different. Times have changed, and
But the commercial success of it was key to what happened next.
The rest of his career.
The rest of his career, yeah. It actually gave him more control, and Warner Brothers particularly really trusted him to be a creative, and gave him a level of kind of creative freedom which I don't think we'll ever see again in the film industry, to be honest.
It is quite interesting that 2001 had those wonderful abstractions, but it also had Howard Johnson and the near future being imagined. So there was all that product placement. There was, exactly, Pan Am. Hardy Ames designing the costumes for Aeroflot as well, and the quote-unquote lady scientist. And that sense of imagining it very close to the present future was really interesting.
I mean, we'll come to that, but I mean, Stanley imagining the future, even the way he worked with his Final Cut Pro downstairs, which cost Warner Brothers about $250,000, and he would want to edit, and there wasn't a machine to edit at home in those days, so he constructed one, and on every front he could see he was looking to the future, and 2001, so much in that, which I'm sure we'll talk about, which is just unbelievable what he saw and what is there, whether it was commercial stuff and products, or whether it was something much more profound, which we're now living with.
Yeah, and he was interested in what was much more profound, and so was Arthur C. Clarke, and I talked to both of them at great lengths. While neither of them was religious, they were very much aware that they were a tiny little grain of sand. Yeah, they didn't. I mean, we have 1 billion stars in our galaxy alone. I mean, there is. Arthur, I quote Arthur now. He said, "Well, some people think that we are the only intelligent being in the universe. If I hear that, I must say I'm still looking for it on Earth."
Actually, with the rest of the planet, we were watching the moon landing. And because when 2001 was made, he was working with the best information available at the time, and he had talked to every expert that he could, make contact with. So when we were watching the moon landing and we saw our Earth for the first time, really, he was all disappointed because he thought, "Oh, I didn't make the Earth in 2001 blue enough and green enough," because you can see. So he was a bit disappointed and wished that he had made our Earth as jewel-like in the film as it really is. But it was amazing. And no, he didn't film the landing.
It is interesting how some of the advice he had came from people who'd worked with Werner von Braun, the German inventor of the V-2 rocket, who was whisked to America to avoid being tried as a war criminal, who was also the model for, you could say, Dr. Strangelove.
Yes, that's right.
And without holding Jan's next section up too far, Arthur C. Clarke said about 2001, if you watch it and feel as though you understand it, then we've failed. And that to me, it's really interesting, because that really is talking about ambiguity, and ambiguity becomes a huge element of Kubrick's filmmaking, and the audience finding the meaning for themselves, and the fact that he never liked to talk about what his films
I was going to say just that, but he talked about, to make a film, you need a camera, a tape recorder, and imagination. To watch a film of Stanley's, that also asks you to imagine a world. Things aren't necessarily clarified in the way they are in so many films. They're not simple. So you can immerse yourself in it. I mean, it's incredible, the beginning of 2001, that you can put that in the cinema and expect to get away with it. No wonder some people who didn't have the imagination to understand it didn't get it. And now we all get it. And every major filmmaker, Chris Nolan, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, for them this was an experience beyond belief when they were young men and went to see it. They just couldn't believe what they were seeing.
And it gave them freedom too. They felt
emboldened. They could do.
And that he'd opened the floodgates to people using their imaginations. And basically 2001, there had never been a film like that. All the space movies had been about bug-eyed monsters. They were B movies, and I'm sure a lot of the people who were behind the audience, who were behind me in the audience at the premiere in 1968, when I was 14, it was a rented audience, I think, and there was a lot of blue rinses and pearls, and they didn't know what the heck was going on, and there was many walkouts. And then I remember in the hotel that night or the next morning, and the reviews were not good. There were massive critics who just didn't understand what the heck was going on. And I just remember a lot of very depressed adults pacing around. And then there was a DJ on the radio who said, I've just seen these movies, and wow, man, it's so groovy, you got to go and check out this film. And yes, so, within a day or two, there were lines of, as Jan said, young people, young teenagers, young men going to see this movie because they didn't have closed minds, and they were able to take on this film as a non-verbal experience. And 50 years on, and I had this conversation with actually Christopher Nolan, who famously did his unrestored version, is that who you are and how old you are and what your life experience is how you receive that film. It's like being put in front of a work of art. There's no explanation. And and Stanley didn't want to explain it, because if he explained it, it would remove your imagination, what you took from it, and your version of what happened. So people are 50 years down the road still talking about it. If you have a religious view or a scientific view, or you're 5 years old. I mean, I showed it to my 77-year-old sort of mother-in-law, and she'd never seen it, she'd know anything about it, and she loved it because she didn't have a preconceived idea. And I think if you are lucky enough to see it for the first time now, I think it's got to be an amazing experience, because there is no CGI. This is a glue and string and paint and models.
Right.
This is Airfix kits. This is a bunch of very highly talented, highly driven art department people slaving away to the small hours, just trying to come up with stuff that hasn't been done before, and it has to be absolutely pristine. And the only thing is, I was working at Pinewood on another movie, and Dick Donner was shooting the first Superman movie, this 1977, and he had a crew showing of 2001. This is 1977, so he said, okay, guys, these are the goalposts. We have to make our movie as good as this. So that was his sort of, his talk to his crew to get them all psyched up. And that was a few years later, and I think that is still true today. It still is the golden standard of making it real.
But what can I want to say one thing to tell the story. I don't know if some of you may have heard it, about Steven Spielberg's experience of seeing this film. The first time he was at Harvard or University in California, his friends had seen it, and they said to him, "You've got to see this film. It's like being on a trip, Stephen." And Stephen had never been on a trip, so he didn't know what they meant. And then he went to see the film, and he said, "I was on a trip." Unbelievable. He suddenly had this experience. It completely, he went into another space. And
How many people have not seen 2001? Oh, well, my advice is to come and see it as part of our season. But go online and seek out the screening, which is on 70mm, and we've booked the print with the help of Warner Brothers, because it is the restoration that Christopher Nolan did as a photochemical 70mm restoration, and it's part of the season, and I'll be here for that for sure, watching it for the 40th time. I'm bringing my teenage kids and who haven't seen it, so I'm very excited about it. Talking of trips, if you're immersing yourself in Kubrick, either do or don't take Night Nurse, because I've had some extremely weird experiences the last few days. Okay, Jan.
Right, well, I come back down to earth to real production issues. What Stanley wanted to do is show something that nobody had ever seen, because it's in the universe. How do you do this? Yeah, it's very, very, very difficult for the art department to come up with designs of something that nobody had ever seen. It's almost impossible, but I'll show you some of their suggestions. Right, I stop here because this goes on for another 15 minutes. And Stanley didn't use any of it, but he kicked it all out. And it was then replaced by, as you know, by the split scan and by other elements which were shot and distorted in the lab. Wonderful sequence. Right, now we are still going back to his innovations. We go through the list. One of the things is using this f/07 very super fast lens for the candlelight photography in Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. That was a pure fluke. He discovered this in American Cinematographer. That's a magazine. They talked about this lens. It's a 50mm lens to be used for satellite photography by NASA. And Stanley was very keen. He said, imagine, f0 points, amazing. Try to get one. Okay, I called Zeiss in Oberkochen, and this man said, well, yes, we made a whole bunch for them, but you can't use this. I said, why not? Well, the rear element is only 3.7mm away from the film plane. There's no, you can't even put a shutter in there. There is no camera. Forget it. So I told this to Stanley, and that's so typical for Stanley. He said, well, why don't you call him back and tell him, let us worry about that. And shall I go on?
Yes.
And another technical thing was a Steadicam that has not been established at that point. It was discovered actually in the same factory where Eddie Giulio, this is the man you just saw, he built it for Gareth Brown, who invented it. And Sandy was completely over the moon hearing about it. And we hired also Gareth Brown to be the operator, and he put the Steadicam with The Shining on the map.
Did he? He also used it in A Clockwork Orange, I think, for a couple of scenes.
No, not at all. That was a wheelchair. It was a wheelchair. No, he always wanted that because building tracks is such a nuisance. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and of course you have to fake a setup, but you can't see the track. Otherwise, it's ABC, right? Here, you had Garrett Brown in tennis shoes running behind the boy. Easy.
I think Stanley would have come up with the drone within, a lot earlier than they've come up with it now.
Okay.
He'd have loved the drone, yeah.
And just to end with this, now, then 25 years later, the Steadicam is now an absolute standard piece of equipment for any film crew, and the great advantage is you have now with radio mics, you have a man or a woman having the Steadicam, and you have everybody else is gone. You have 360 degrees of freedom to film.
So I guess where we're driving at with all of these technical innovations is what lies behind all of this is that Stanley was really trying to do something with the form, as many great artists do. They have a preoccupation with the form in which they work, and he was striving to create a new kind of cinema, and in order to do so, he was using these techniques to achieve things that hadn't been achieved before, and he was really trying to create a kind of cinema that worked on many levels simultaneously. But understanding the technical innovations are really key to trying to understand the level of effort and the kind of the driven and precise nature of his sort of striving to change the form, if you like.
Yeah.
And I thought one of the key things is to have a look at how he used music. Absolutely.
Yeah. Also, you have to be very open and always very ready to change things. For example, he had a different score on 2001, and then came the idea suddenly of using the Blue Danube. I know Ray Lovejoy told me that they thought he had lost his marbles. I mean, an old Viennese waltz for space music, it's ridiculous. Well, but he liked it, and it meant that he had to recut the whole scene because he would not touch the Blue Danube. That had to be played from the beginning to the end. So, it's an intuition. Another thing is pure accident. His wife, Christiane, heard on the radio Ligeti. She ran to the cutting room and said, "Stanley, listen to this." And for the first time, he heard Ligeti. And that was the answer. They said, that. And so there are many, many things are also a bit of luck. And to be open-minded for everything. Now, here, our topic now is music as a tool. And he opened 2001 with Richard Strauss. And of course, he cut the film to the music. You never mess around with the music if you like it. And the key part of choosing music is that the director who chooses it must be in love with it. That's the key thing. Otherwise, it becomes really like parmesan over pasta. Yeah.
Well, we're starting to run a little short on time, so I think we should move on to Katharina, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, you've got my clips there.
Okay. Now, maybe you tell a little bit about The Shining and how it came up with these designs.
Okay, so Dad used me as a location researcher, prop buyer, and photographer. And when they was doing The Shining, the hotel is famously built on a former Indian burial ground. So obviously, and they'd obviously found the hotel in Colorado. So they had to find something that they could make it look more American and more ethnic and sympathetic to that particular state. So we were looking through American Indian art magazines, and specifically pottery, sculpture, and carpets and rugs. So Dad decided that it would be really cool to decorate this huge hotel with examples of American Indian tribal art. So I was dispatched to Scottsdale, Arizona, to meet with a gallery owner who specialized in tribal art, and I went to look at all these amazing rugs and carpets, only to discover that they were, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they were prime examples of their particular art, and there was no way that they were going to hire them for a movie. So I called Dad and said, look, this is not going to happen. I'm sure you're not going to pay this amount of money. So then they had to be copied. But the overall look of the hotel, the feel of the hotel is very American. It couldn't possibly be anywhere else. It's very specific to that region. And there's only one, I think, original rug in the set. But in a way, it's a jolly good thing that they weren't real carpets, because that set burned down. And I also was getting props, kitchen props, bathroom props, that sort of thing. And after that, I went to Anchorage in Alaska to look for a second unit location for Halloran Landing in the snow. But the carpets, you will see, decorate the set in The Shining very beautifully. And then we've got Eyes Wide Shut. So the Harford's apartment, New York apartment, and there was a lot of research. There was a lot of photographs taken of real American New York apartments. And the set that was built in the end at Pine was kind of an amalgamation of the set that we had, of the flat that we had on the west side of Manhattan and on the east side. It was a sort of combination of the two. And I remember being at home and Dad and I and Mum, we were sitting there, and Daddy's going, I don't know how to decorate the set. I don't want it to be interior designed. I don't want it to be set designed or production designed. I want it to look really real. And he's kind of looking around the living room, and he's going, well, we got nice stuff. I mean, why don't we just use this? And he said to my mother, he said, you got great taste. Let's just use this stuff. Because he was very particular that things looked real and genuine, like you would have it. I mean, our apartments in New York didn't have as many paintings because, Mum's been painting a really long time, so there's literally hundreds of thousands of them. So almost every piece of furniture in the Harford's apartment, it's Mummy's paintings, one of my paintings, the cat that I did for his birthday, which he put in the hallway, which was really nice of him, vases, jugs, my dining tables, my dining chairs, an antique table is in the billiard room. I look at that film and I see, oh, there's the thing, and there's the candlestick, and there's the we didn't have anything to sit on for the longest time.
The kind of budgetary control that Stanley he was hustling on the
Stanley
budget.
was incredible about, he realised how much money he had to spend or didn't have to spend.
Well, yeah, and when I was 15, he gave me a camera, one of his old Nicomats, actually, for Christmas, and he then proceeded to teach me how to take photographs, how to develop them, all of which was very wonderful until I realised his ulterior motive, which was I was now employable. and
cheap.
And cheap. Well, free, actually. Free. And we had where he was editing Clockwork Orange in the garage at Abbotsmead in Elstree, and they built a dark room, and when I used to come home from school, I'd be given some rolls of film to develop and make end prints and contact sheets, and that's why I learned my craft.
What fascinates me about Stanley Kubrick and his films was that he is the most architectural of filmmakers. Metaphorically, I was very struck by a quote that he wrote in which he described how it was so important to keep the feeling of the first moment he read a book throughout the making of the film. And that is exactly the experience that a serious architect will also try throughout the kind of long drawn-out process of making a building happen. They have to have that spark, which actually shapes all their thinking. But also, in a literal sense, if you look at Barry Lyndon, which, I love 2001, but Barry Lyndon is one I've lost my heart to, you actually explore the architecture of 18th century, apparently England, but actually the series of rooms and spaces and exteriors, which are all over the United Kingdom and way into Germany. And he's creating architecture which seems so real, but actually has been made in his head. Those images are so stunningly beautiful. We should have got the National Gallery in Tate Britain involved in this collaboration with the Kubrick season, because you could do a tour of the paintings.
It really is the most painterly film I think that anyone ever made, and it's a sumptuous experience on the big screen here. I know I keep going on about it, but I'm very devoted to big screen cinema experience.
Yeah, the art department in Ireland, we took over the top floor of the Ardrey Hotel in Waterford, which is no longer there, and I think Stanley ripped up every really decent art book to take out all the pictures of paintings for fabrics, rooms, dresses, costumes, and the general sort of patina. He said, because you can't design that. Why design something that already exists? Copy what was.
And
The film still has to be discovered in the UK and in America, because the film was only hugely successful in Japan and in the Latin countries and the Mediterranean countries, not in the UK, not in Northern Europe, not in the United States and Canada. Interesting, isn't it?
Go figure.
And the same happened with Eyes Wide Shut. Exactly the same countries where the film was a huge hit in Italy, Spain, Japan, France, not in the UK, not in America. Why?
Well, I would say that the BFI could re-release it, but we did it a couple of years ago. So.
Hal is the great-grandfather of Alexa and a lot more fun to be with, I imagine. And just to remind you, when you see this film again, those of you who use FaceTime, well, Stanley was using FaceTime, and it was
1967.
Vivian Stanley's daughter, talking, playing the part. So
a Skype call.
A Skype call. I'd call it Skype.
And these guys are using iPads. And
they're all using iPads. All the technology is that. I mean, it's unbelievable. And there's this thing called voice print, I think it's called, isn't it? Which is actually voice recognition. I mean, it's unbelievable. Really is.
It's the bigger picture, but it's also the detail. Notice that Arne Jacobsen fork, which still looks modern now.
Yeah.
And the fact that he actually worked with Elliot Noyes, who was IBM's design director. He was the first curator of design at MoMA. He designed the IBM electric golf ball, and he had a go at doing HAL, although actually it was a design which Kubrick rejected because he'd produced something which was large enough for 7 men to fit into.
And Kubrick was really interested in automata, and AI and automata. Automata is something that comes back and back in his films. And AI especially was a project that he was interested in, and obviously famously he had the film AI as a project which eventually Steven Spielberg made, and that's also showing here as part of this season as well.
He prepared it for 1 year. For 1 year we were on AI, artificial intelligence, and then he offers it to Steven Spielberg. I was quite shocked. Why
did he do that? What was
600 drawings they had already made by Chris Baker of how it should look like. Well, he felt that Steven would be the better director for it. Very high tech and all this, and in a way it's very good because he finally made Eyes Wide Shut, which he wanted to do since 1970. For 30 years he was brewing over this. No?
I mean, we're living in a world also of Google, and I always feel that Stanley, first of all, he lived a 24/7 life because he was, when you were all asleep, he was on the phone to Los Angeles, or wherever he might be. And I talked about this creation of this editing machine that he could make, which was huge and which now every young person has. And at the same time, when he was making Napoleon, his obsession was finding out everything about him. Well, you couldn't just go on Google and get it. You had to go and get it. And he sent these students around the world and paid their costs. What about 22 students or whatever it was? And they went to various people, museums and libraries to collect material, which you can see, little Google box.
Well, it's an analog Wikipedia, which we're going to show.
Which you'll see in the exhibition.
17,000 slides, photographs of material that was before photography, paintings and drawings and all that kind of stuff.
A kind of preparation and meticulous approach, which is quite rare these days. Although there are some auteur directors who are, I think, creating work which has the spirit of Kubrick.
But he was the one. He was the first person to think like that, and it's not just as a filmmaker, but as a man who could trying to imagine always what it would be like, what the future would be like. I mean, it's incredible.
He was a real information sponge, and every time he started a project, he then had to find out everything there was to know on Earth about this particular subject. So he knew every expert, and he could just call people up and say it's Stanley Kubrick, and they'd hang up because they didn't believe him, and then they'd have to call up again. But he was very irritating because it didn't seem that there was anything he didn't know, and he was very useful to have around when you were doing homework. But what people will see at the exhibition is the amount of research, the detail, the stuff that you think is actually inconsequential, but it informs later decisions. So even though he was very free form and he was very willing to, hear ideas from his cast and crew, and it was a collaborative effort. It was his vision, but he said, there's no such thing as a bad idea. If you have an idea, tell me what it is and we'll talk about it. Matthew Modine famously said that, and also Keir Delay, said we had all kinds of ideas, and we would sit in the trailer or sit in the studio room somewhere and toss ideas around, and Stanley's typical answer would be, well, okay, let's try it, let's see what happens, because he was an artist in that way. He wasn't this strict, boot-slapping dictator shouting at his actors. He was collaborative and very thoughtful. And if you had a good idea, he would try it. But the most impressive thing was always the amount of research that went into absolutely every project. And thank God he never threw anything away. Because otherwise we wouldn't have an exhibition.
Well, I feel as though we could sit here for probably a few weeks talking more about Kubrick. We have run out of time because the Clockwork Oranges are coming on in this cinema in about 25 minutes. So please do come to the show at the Design Museum, come and see all the films here at the BFI. Do go online and find out more. As I said earlier, there are more films on BFI Player as well. There are lots of documentaries about Kubrick. But for now, please do join me in thanking our panel, Alan Yentob, Katharina Kubrick, Dejan Sujic, and Jan Harlan.